Now, they don't do it themselves, but they encourage, not knowingly, they encourage the weak believer to continue in his practices, thus wounding his conscience even more. And so we need to be very aware around this. Now, believers can also, in the same manner, affect the consciences of unbelievers as well, because, as we said, the conscience between the believer and unbeliever remains exactly the same. The role doesn't change. And so just as a believer can affect the conscience of a weak believer, a mature believer, shall we say, so a believer can affect the conscience of an unbeliever. Let's look at a passage of scripture that just describes that concept to us. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 27 to 29. Scripture says, if any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not of your own, but of that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? So it's a very interesting passage of scripture, a very enlightening passage of scripture for us pertaining to the subject of the conscience. Because here we have a believer being invited to dinner at the home of, most probably at the home of an unbeliever, and he goes along. And Paul says, when you get there and you eat whatever's put before you, just go ahead and eat. Don't ask him, did you guys offer this to an idol? Because he said, it's got nothing to do with you. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. You pray over your food and it's fine. You can eat it. But he says, but if the unbeliever says to you, this was offered to idols. Now Paul says, okay, now the line's been drawn. Now you cannot partake of that food anymore. Now it's not because that food has now automatically now become unclean to you, not at all. He says the reason that you're not to eat of that food is because if you do, you now affect the conscience of the unbeliever negatively. Now, why do you do that? Because the conscience remains exactly the same in both believer and unbeliever. And even amongst the unbeliever, the conscience is telling them not to eat food offered to idols. Now, they've been brought up like that their whole lives. They've always served these foreign gods, whatever they might be. So they've overridden their conscience. Their conscience become very weak in this area, cannot really convict them anymore. But Paul says, I don't want you to add to that by weakening their conscience anymore. So how does the Christian do that? Well, if the unbeliever says to the Christian, all right, I've offered this to idols, and now the Christian partakes of that. The unbeliever says to himself, okay, his God must be just a similar God to mine, because he's quite comfortable with eating food that I've offered to my God. And so he draws no distinction anymore. And so his conscience can't be affected in saying, don't eat that, because now he's seen a Christian eating that after he's told him, this is what I've done, I offered this to idols. And so Paul says you can't do that. He says, now you've got to draw the line and say, sorry, I can't eat this. Why? Because I serve God, and I cannot eat food that has now been offered to another God. Now, when the Christian does that, now the conscience of the unbeliever kicks in, and the conscience can convict him and say, yes, you see, I've been trying to tell you all the time, it's not right what you're doing. That Christian is telling you the right thing. And so that's how Christians can affect negatively or even positively the conscience of the unbeliever.